Before we had names for them, before the first fossil was pulled from the rock and the first scientists tried to make sense of what they were looking at, the dinosaurs were simply the world. For 165 million years, they were what life on land looked like. Not a chapter in the story of Earth. The story of Earth for longer than the human mind can genuinely hold without reducing it to abstraction. The entirety of human history, from the first stone tool to the present moment, fits inside a single % of the time that dinosaurs walked this planet. To say that the age of the dinosaurs was long is to say that the Pacific Ocean is large. Technically true. Inadequate. We're going to spend 4 parts looking at how they actually lived, not the species names and the taxonomic debates and the museum skeleton photographs, but the texture of life on Earth in the time before us. What the air felt like, what the ground looked like underfoot, what it meant to be hungry or hunted, or to find water in a landscape so different from anything alive today that traveling to it would feel more like arriving on another planet than visiting another country. Subscribe before we go any further. Drop a comment right now telling us where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. We love hearing from you. The first thing to understand about the world the dinosaurs lived in is that it was not one world. 165 million years contains more change than any single description can hold. The dinosaurs that emerged in the late Triassic period, approximately 230 million years ago, lived on a planet whose geography bore no resemblance to the planet we know. At that point in Earth's history, the continents had not yet separated. The landmass that would eventually become every continent on the modern map was assembled into a single supercontinent, Pangaea, surrounded by a single global ocean. The climate of this world was dry and hot in the interior, where the distance from the ocean was too great for moisture to reach, and the coastlines and equatorial regions were wetter, the specific combination of warmth and humidity that supports the kind of plant life that large terrestrial animals require. By the time the dinosaurs reached their peak diversity in the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, the continents had begun to separate. The breakup of Pangaea was slow by any human timescale, tens of millions of years of continental drift producing new oceans, new coastlines, new mountain ranges, and new climate zones. The world of the late Cretaceous, the period that ended with the mass extinction 66 million years ago, was geographically more recognizable than the world of the Triassic, though still deeply alien in its specifics. The Atlantic Ocean was narrower than it is today. The continents sat at different latitudes, in positions that affected the climate patterns over them in ways that had no direct modern equivalent. The polar regions were warmer than they are today, warm enough in some periods to support forests where today there is ice. The equatorial regions were warmer still, warm enough that the shallow inland seas that covered parts of what are now continental interiors were in some periods uncomfortably hot by any modern standard. The atmosphere of the Mesozoic era was different from the atmosphere we breathe. Oxygen levels varied across the era, generally higher than today in the Triassic and early Jurassic, lower in parts of the Cretaceous, with implications for the physiology of the animals that breathed it. Carbon dioxide levels were substantially higher than modern levels for most of the era, producing a greenhouse effect that maintained the warmth that characterizes Mesozoic climate. The warmth was not uniform. There were cold periods and warm periods, dry periods and wet periods, volcanic episodes that temporarily altered the atmospheric chemistry in ways that affected the vegetation and the animal life that depended on it. But the baseline was warmer than today, dramatically so in some periods, found the absence of permanent ice at the poles meant that sea levels were higher, coastlines were different, and the distribution of habitable land was organized in ways that had no modern parallel. The scale of geological time that the dinosaur era spans is worth attempting to feel, rather than simply to state, because the numbers alone do not convey what 165 million years actually means. If you compress the entire history of life on Earth into a single calendar year, the dinosaurs would not appear until late October. They would dominate the land from late October through the second week of December. The mass extinction that ended the non-avian dinosaurs would happen on the 14th of December. Human beings would appear in the last few minutes of December 31st. Every human civilization, every city, every written language every recorded history fits inside the last few seconds of that year. The dinosaurs did not briefly appear and then disappear. They occupied the planet for longer than any mammal lineage has ever existed, longer than the current arrangement of continents has been in place, longer than the Atlantic Ocean has been wide enough to be called an ocean. Their story is not a brief prologue to ours. Ours is a very recent footnote to theirs. The temperature of the Mesozoic world deserves more detailed treatment because it shaped everything about how the dinosaurs lived and why they were able to reach the sizes and the diversities that they did. The average global temperature for much of the Jurassic and Cretaceous was somewhere between 6 and 12 degrees Celsius, warmer than today's global average. This does not sound like a large number until you consider what it means in practice. At those temperatures, there was no permanent ice anywhere on the planet. The polar regions, which today are among the most inhospitable places on Earth for large terrestrial animals, were forested. Fossil plants recovered from rocks in Antarctica that date to the Cretaceous include species that required a warm, seasonal climate to grow. Evidence that the continent now buried under kilometers of ice was once covered in trees. The warmth of the Mesozoic world was not just a background condition. It was an enabling condition, making habitable enormous areas of the planet that today are too cold, too dry, or too extreme for large animals to sustain themselves in. The water of the Mesozoic world was distributed differently than it is today, and the distribution of water determined the distribution of life in ways that shaped the evolution of every animal that lived through the era. Higher global temperatures meant that more water evaporated from the oceans and fell as precipitation over the land, producing a generally wetter world in many continental regions than the same latitudes experienced today. But the arrangement of the continents and the patterns of ocean circulation that the arrangement produced created regional variations in rainfall that were in some cases more extreme than modern regional variations. The continental interiors of Pangaea in the Triassic were in some areas as dry as modern deserts, simply because the distance from the ocean was too great for moisture to travel. As the continents separated and coastlines multiplied, the continental interiors became more accessible to marine moisture, and the general pattern of the Jurassic and Cretaceous was wetter than the Triassic in most areas, with the specific patterns of rainfall and seasonality varying enormously by latitude and by the particular configuration of land and sea at any given moment in the era. The plants that covered this world were not the plants we know. The early Mesozoic was dominated by conifers, cycads, ferns, and horsetails, a vegetation community that produced a landscape unlike anything in the modern world. There were no grasses, no flowering plants for the first 100 million years of the dinosaur era, and then the flowering plants, the angiosperms, began to appear and diversify in the Cretaceous, spreading across the landscape in a way that changed the food available to plant-eating dinosaurs and the cover available to all of them. By the end of the Cretaceous, flowering plants had become a significant component of the vegetation in many parts of the world, and the landscape of the late Mesozoic was beginning to develop something that had the character, if not the specific species, of modern ecosystems. The forests that the largest plant-eating dinosaurs moved through were dominated by tall conifers, whose trunks rose tens of meters before branching, producing a canopy high above the ground and a forest floor that received limited light. The undergrowth in these forests was composed of ferns and low cycads rather than the grasses and broadleaf shrubs of modern forests. The visual character of this landscape, if you could stand in it and look around, would be immediately recognizable as forest in its broad structure, with the specific quality of a place where the architecture is familiar, but the details are all wrong. The tree trunks would be the right shapes, but the bark would be wrong. The light filtering through the canopy would feel right, but the leaves it filtered through would not. The sounds of the forest, the wind and the water and the movement of branches would be sounds you recognized. The animal sounds would not. The oceans of the Mesozoic were inhabited by the marine reptiles, the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs and mosasaurs, animals that were not dinosaurs, but that occupied the ocean the way dinosaurs occupied the land. As the dominant large fauna of their environment, the seas themselves were warmer than modern oceans, particularly in the tropics and at the poles, where the temperature differential between equatorial and polar waters was smaller than today. The chemistry of these seas was different, with periods of low oxygen in the deep water, called anoxic events, that affected the distribution of marine life and left their signature in the sedimentary record. The reefs of the Mesozoic were built by different organisms than modern coral reefs, with rudest bivalves and other extinct groups contributing to the reef structure that supported the diversity of marine life around them. The skies above this world were inhabited by the pterosaurs, flying reptiles that were also not dinosaurs, but that filled the aerial ecological roles that birds fill today. The range of pterosaur sizes was extraordinary, from species the size of a sparrow to the largest flying animals that have ever existed, with wingspans that exceeded any modern bird. They coexisted with the earliest birds, which had evolved from a lineage of feathered dinosaurs in the Jurassic and which were diversifying through the Cretaceous into the many ecological niches that birds occupy today. The air of the Mesozoic was, like every other dimension of this world, full of life unlike anything that exists now, occupying ecological roles by different means and with different bodies than the animals that fill equivalent roles today. The sounds of the Mesozoic world are something that no researcher can fully reconstruct, but that the available evidence allows us to begin imagining. The insects of the Mesozoic included many groups whose modern descendants are among the loudest acoustic presences in any ecosystem: cicadas, crickets, katydids. Fossil evidence of these groups in Mesozoic deposits is substantial, and the inference that their acoustic behavior was similar to that of their modern relatives is supported by the preservation of their sound-producing structures in exceptional fossil specimens. The forests would have had insect sound in them, perhaps at comparable intensities to modern tropical forests on warm evenings. The wind in the conifers and tree ferns would have produced sounds recognizable as wind in trees. The water in streams and rivers would have sounded like water. What would have been absent or present only in different forms were the calls of large land animals that we associate today with wild places, the bellowing of large mammals, the complex vocalizations of birds beyond what the earliest avian lineages produced. The soundscape of the Mesozoic was real and complex, but it was not the soundscape of anywhere on Earth today. The day length of the Mesozoic world was different from today's, a fact that affects how you imagine a single day in the life of a dinosaur. The Earth's rotation has been slowing very gradually throughout its history as a result of tidal friction with the Moon, meaning that days in the Mesozoic were shorter than days today. A day in the early Jurassic was approximately 23 hours long. A day in the mid-Cretaceous was approximately 23.5 hours. The difference is small, but it compounds across seasons and years in ways that affect the total hours of daylight and darkness that an animal experiences. The longer nights of the Mesozoic, relative to modern nights, may have been relevant to the behavior of animals active at different times of day, and the slightly shorter years, which contained more days, would have influenced the seasonal rhythms that organized the lives of animals attuned to the length of days as a cue for breeding, migration, or other seasonal behaviors. The night sky over the Mesozoic world was, in one specific sense, the same sky we see today. The same stars were present, though the constellations would have looked different, because the movement of stars relative to each other across millions of years shifts their positions perceptibly. The Moon was slightly closer to the Earth than it is today, appearing marginally larger in the sky, its tidal influence on the Earth's rotation marginally stronger. The dark sky, in the absence of any artificial light anywhere on the planet, would have been far more intensely populated with stars than any night sky visible from any populated area today. An animal with the visual capacity to use that light and the ecological niche that made nighttime activity valuable would have had access to navigational and behavioral cues from the night sky that the light-polluted world makes it difficult for us to fully imagine. The Mesozoic darkness was full. The geological forces that shaped this world were active in ways that produced dramatic events on timescales that are long by human standards, but short by geological ones. Volcanic eruptions, some of them among the largest in Earth's history, periodically altered the atmospheric chemistry and the climate in ways that placed extraordinary stress on the organisms living through them. The movement of the continents created and destroyed seaways, altered ocean circulation patterns, and produced new mountain ranges that changed the distribution of rainfall across continental interiors. The world that dinosaurs inhabited was not the stable background of a natural history film. It was a dynamic, continuously changing environment that challenged the life within it constantly, and that eliminated species and ecosystems on timescales that make the changes of the modern era look rapid only in comparison to geological deep time. The dinosaurs that emerged in the late Triassic and diversified through the Jurassic and Cretaceous were not adapting to one world. They were adapting continuously to a world that kept changing under them, and the adaptations that survived to the end of the era were the ones flexible enough or specialized enough to track those changes across millions of years of environmental flux. What that looked like in practice, what the daily life of the animals doing this adapting actually involved, is what the next three parts are for. The world they lived in was alien and enormous and ancient. The lives they lived in it were, in some ways, recognizable. Both of those things are true, and holding them simultaneously is what understanding the dinosaurs requires. The insects of the Mesozoic were not simply the background noise of the world, they were one of the primary drivers of ecological change across the era, and their diversification tracked the diversification of the plants and animals around them in ways that made the Mesozoic an era of extraordinary ecological complexity. The pollinating insects that evolved alongside the first flowering plants in the Cretaceous were one of the pivotal ecological relationships in the history of life, a co-evolutionary partnership that produced the flowering plant diversity that now dominates terrestrial vegetation, and that supported an expansion of insect diversity that continues today. The dinosaurs that lived through this diversification were not simply witnesses to it, they were participants, as the plants that provided their food and cover responded to the presence of pollinators, and as the insects that mediated plant reproduction were themselves part of the food webs that fed the smallest dinosaurs and the young of the largest. The geography of the late Cretaceous world, which is the period best represented in the popular imagination of the dinosaur era, included a feature of the North American landscape that is particularly striking to anyone who has crossed the Great Plains by car or plane. The interior of the continent was covered by a shallow inland sea. The Western Interior Seaway, a body of water that ran from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the Gulf of Mexico in the south, divided North America into two landmasses for much of the Cretaceous. The western landmass, which geologists call Larimedia, and the eastern landmass called Appalachia, each had their own distinct dinosaur communities, separated by the sea in a way that allowed the evolution of different species on each side over millions of years of geographic isolation. The interior sea was warm, shallow, and rich in marine life, and its coastlines were some of the most productive environments in the Cretaceous world. The dinosaurs that lived along those coasts would have been standing at the edge of a body of water that no longer exists, in a landscape that has been dry land for 60 million years. The end of the dinosaur era was not a sudden event in any human sense of the word, though 66 million years of geological perspective can make it look sudden. The impact of a large asteroid or comet with the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico produced immediate effects of extraordinary violence, followed by years and decades of atmospheric disruption that altered the climate globally. The immediate effects included wildfires across large areas of the Northern Hemisphere, driven by the thermal pulse of material ejected into the atmosphere and returning to Earth as intense radiation. The longer-term effects included a global cooling produced by dust and sulfur particles blocking sunlight, which reduced plant productivity worldwide and collapsed the food chains that supported the large animals of the era. What the impact ended was not just the dinosaurs. It ended the Mesozoic, the entire world that the dinosaurs had built and inhabited across 165 million years of continuous evolution. The world that followed was a different world, built by the survivors of an extinction that eliminated roughly 3/4 of all species on Earth. The diversity of environments that dinosaurs inhabited across the era was as great as the diversity of environments on Earth today, and in some periods greater. Polar forests, tropical coastlines, semi-arid continental interiors, river floodplains, upland highlands, the margins of shallow inland seas. All of these were environments that different dinosaur communities occupied across different periods of the Mesozoic. The animals that lived in polar forests experienced months of continuous darkness, followed by months of continuous daylight, a seasonal extreme that required physiological and behavioral adaptations different from those of animals living near the equator. The animals of the arid interior were subject to the heat and the water scarcity that desert environments impose in any era. The animals of the coastal margins were subject to the flooding and the seasonal productivity that estuarine environments produce in any era. The dinosaur story is not one story. It is the story of hundreds of different ecological communities, each adapted to the specific conditions of their specific environment, across a span of time that contained multiple cycles of climatic change that repeatedly reorganized which environments existed and where. The rocks that preserve the evidence of the Mesozoic world are distributed across every continent on Earth, including Antarctica, and the fossils within them have been accumulating in museum collections and research institutions since the middle of the 19th century. The pace of discovery has not slowed. New species are described every year, and new techniques for analyzing existing specimens, from CT scanning that reveals internal bone structure without destroying the specimen to isotopic analysis that can reveal the temperature at which an animal's tooth enamel formed, continue to extract information from material that has been sitting in museum drawers for a century. The picture of the Mesozoic world that emerges from this accumulating evidence is not the picture that existed 50 years ago, and it will not be the picture that exists 50 years from now. What we know about how dinosaurs actually lived is growing, and what the growth is revealing is a world more complex, more dynamic, and more inhabited by animals with more sophisticated behaviors than the older picture allowed. The dinosaurs did not live in an empty world waiting for them to fill it. The Mesozoic was full of life at every scale, from the microbial communities in the soil that processed dead organic matter into nutrients for plants, to the vast communities of invertebrates that occupied every available ecological role in terrestrial and aquatic environments, to the fish and marine reptiles and pterosaurs that shared the world with the dinosaurs without belonging to their lineage. The ecological web of the Mesozoic was as intricate and as interdependent as any modern ecosystem, and the dinosaurs were part of that web rather than above it. They were eaten by parasites, they were afflicted by disease, they competed with each other and with non-dinosaurian animals for food and space. They died in floods and droughts and volcanic events and were killed by each other. They were born into a world that was trying to kill them from their first moment in it, which is the same world that every animal is born into in every era. That is the world the next three parts will spend their time in. The transition from the Triassic to the Jurassic, which marked the beginning of the great radiation of dinosaur diversity, was itself preceded by a mass extinction event that cleared the ecological stage of many of the animals that had been the dominant large terrestrial fauna before the dinosaurs' rise. The end Triassic extinction, which occurred approximately 201 million years ago, and which was likely triggered by massive volcanic activity associated with the opening of the Atlantic Ocean, eliminated the large Crurotarsan archosaurs that had been competing with the early dinosaurs for ecological dominance. The disaster that destroyed these competitors created the ecological opportunity that the dinosaurs filled, and the filling of that opportunity across the subsequent Jurassic period produced the diversity that the Jurassic fossil record documents. The age of the dinosaurs did not begin because dinosaurs were inherently superior to the animals they replaced. It began because a catastrophe gave them a chance that the previous inhabitants of the world had not provided. The fossils that preserve this world are not evenly distributed across time or across geography. Fossilization requires a specific and relatively uncommon set of conditions. An animal must die in or near water, be buried quickly by sediment before scavengers can destroy the remains, and then remain buried and undisturbed for millions of years while mineralization gradually replaces the original bone material with stone. The vast majority of animals that ever lived left no fossil record. What we have is a sample, biased toward animals that lived near water, that were large enough for their bones to survive the pressures of burial. And that happened to be buried in sediments that were subsequently uplifted and exposed by erosion into places where humans could find them. The picture of Mesozoic life that the fossil record provides is real and is becoming more detailed with every new discovery, but it is also incomplete in ways that remind us that the fullness of the world the dinosaurs inhabited is beyond what we can recover. What we can recover is enough to be extraordinary. It is not everything. The world that the next 3 parts will examine in detail, the world of daily survival and seasonal change and birth and death and the search for food, was built on this physical and geological foundation. The specific behaviors and the specific challenges that dinosaur life involved were responses to the specific conditions of the world described in this first part. And understanding those conditions is the prerequisite for understanding why the behaviors took the forms they did. The air, the water, the plants, the temperature, the length of the day, the character of the seasons, the configuration of the land and the sea, all of these were the parameters within which dinosaur life unfolded across 165 million years. The next part goes inside that world, to the level of the individual animal, and asks what it actually meant to survive in it. The richness of the Mesozoic world at any single moment is something that the compressed timeline of fossil discovery can make difficult to appreciate. When a paleontologist describes a particular fossil fauna, a community of animals preserved in the same geological formation, they are describing the snapshot of an ecosystem that existed at a specific moment in geological time, a moment that might span hundreds of thousands of years in the imprecise chronology of sedimentary rock, but that represents a real and functioning ecological community with all the complexity that implies. The large plant-eating animals that the formation preserves were not the only animals in the ecosystem. They were the ones most likely to be preserved. Around them were smaller animals, insects, fish, early mammals, lizards, amphibians, whose fossils appear less frequently, but whose presence was as real as the large forms. The ecosystem was full. The predators in it were not simply waiting for the plant-eaters to pass by. They were part of a web of interactions that included everything from the soil fungi that decomposed dead material to the large animals whose bones the rock preserved. The fullness of that web is what the next 3 parts try to reconstruct, one dimension at a time, from the evidence that the rock has kept for us across 66 million years of waiting. The oxygen isotopes preserved in the teeth and bones of Mesozoic animals carry information about the temperature of the water that the animal drank and the temperature of its own body, encoded in the chemistry of the minerals that formed while the animal was alive. Reading this information requires sophisticated laboratory techniques and careful interpretation, but the data it produces has transformed what we know about dinosaur physiology. The isotopic evidence from a growing number of specimens suggests that many dinosaur lineages maintained elevated body temperatures relative to their environment, not through the same mechanism that mammals use, but through some combination of metabolic heat production, large body size that slows heat loss, and behavioral thermoregulation that the animal's behavioral flexibility allowed. The warm, active dinosaur that the modern reconstruction presents is not simply an assumption based on their relationship to birds. It is supported by chemical evidence preserved in the material of their own bodies, waiting to be read by techniques that did not exist when the first fossils were discovered. The world the dinosaurs inhabited was, in its totality, unlike anything that has existed before or since. Not because it was more extreme or more violent or more fertile than other worlds in Earth's history, but because the specific combination of physical conditions and evolutionary history that produced it occurred once and then was replaced by what followed. The warm seas and the conifer forests and the inland waterways and the long evenings with their unfamiliar sounds were real places, inhabited by real animals whose lives mattered in the same way that the lives of any living thing matter, which is completely to the animal living them. The rocks that preserve their bones are telling us something about those lives. We have been getting better at listening. The next part is about what the animals inside that world were actually doing every day, from before dawn to the settling of darkness, in the long middle of a world that had nothing to do with us and everything to do with them. Every animal that ever lived had one primary job. Not reproduction, though reproduction is what evolution optimizes for. Not finding food, though food is what the daily hours are organized around. The primary job, the one that had to be accomplished before anything else was possible, was staying alive through the next few hours. Every behavior that every dinosaur ever performed was either directly in service of this objective, or was a consequence of having achieved it temporarily. The elaborate social behaviors, the parental care, the migration patterns, the growth rates that the fossil record documents, all of these are expressions of animals that had survived long enough to have the surplus time and energy to invest in something beyond the immediate moment. The immediate moment, for most animals in most eras, is survival. The Mesozoic was not an exception. The world the dinosaurs inhabited was a world of predation pressure that operated at every body size and in every habitat. The largest animals were not safe from predation. They were safer than smaller animals, and their size was partly a defense against the attacks of predators that were themselves large. But the fossil record contains evidence of attack and injury on animals of every size class that the Mesozoic produced. The evidence of healed injuries, bones that were broken and then grew back, wounds that left their signatures in the remodeling of bone tissue around them, wounds that did not heal, bite marks left by teeth whose size and spacing can be matched to the jaws of known predators. All of this is present in the Mesozoic fossil record, and all of it tells the same story. Nothing was safe. Subscribe before we go any further. Drop a comment right now telling us where you are watching from and what time it is there. Those comments mean more than you know. The sensory world that a dinosaur inhabited was the medium through which the daily competition between predator and prey was conducted. What a dinosaur could smell, hear, and see determined what it knew about its environment, what it could detect before it was detected, and how quickly it could respond to threats and opportunities. The evidence for dinosaur sensory capabilities comes from multiple sources. The structure of the brain cases preserved in skulls, which reflects the relative development of different brain regions and therefore the relative emphasis on different sensory systems. The structure of the eye sockets and the bones of the inner ear, which constrain estimates of visual field size and hearing range. And comparison with living relatives, both crocodilians and birds, which bracket the range of sensory capabilities that the ancestral dinosaurian lineage likely possessed. The vision of many dinosaur lineages was likely acute in ways that the eye socket structure supports. Large eyes relative to skull size suggest investment in visual processing capacity. The forward-facing eyes of some predatory lineages suggest binocular overlap and therefore depth perception, the visual capability most valuable for judging the distance to a moving target. The laterally placed eyes of many plant-eating lineages suggest wide visual fields that extended well behind the animal, providing early warning of approach from any direction at the cost of the binocular depth perception that forward-facing eyes provide. This trade-off between depth perception and field of view is one that modern animals navigate the same way, with predators generally having more forward-facing eyes and prey more lateral ones, and the dinosaur fossil record is consistent with this pattern appearing early and being maintained across the era. The smell capability of many dinosaur lineages was substantial, based on the preserved olfactory structures in brain cases that show large olfactory bulbs relative to the rest of the brain. An animal with large olfactory bulbs is an animal that processes smell information extensively, which implies that smell is a primary channel through which it learns about its environment. For a predator, this means locating prey by scent at distances that vision would not reach and in conditions of darkness or dense vegetation where vision is limited. For a prey animal, it means detecting the presence of a predator before the predator is close enough to be seen, giving the prey animal time to react before the predator has committed to an attack. The fossil evidence for large olfactory processing in many dinosaur lineages suggests that the world they moved through was as rich in chemical information as it was in visual and acoustic information, and that they were reading all of it simultaneously. The evidence of disease and parasitism in the Mesozoic fossil record adds a dimension to the survival story that is easy to overlook, when the dramatic interactions between predators and prey dominate the picture. Dinosaur bones preserve evidence of infections, tumors, joint disease, and bone remodeling, consistent with injuries that healed imperfectly. Some specimens show bone pathologies that are consistent with specific diseases known in modern reptiles and birds, the closest living relatives of the non-avian dinosaurs. The parasites that occupied the Mesozoic were not the same species that exist today, but the ecological roles of blood-feeding insects, internal worms, and skin parasites were almost certainly present in Mesozoic ecosystems, occupied by the ancestors of modern parasite lineages. An animal navigating the survival challenge of the Mesozoic was not only managing the threat of predators and the challenge of finding food and water, it was also managing the chronic burden of the organisms that were trying to live inside it or on it, extracting resources at the animal's expense. The growth rates of dinosaurs, reconstructed from growth rings preserved in their bones, in the same way that tree rings record annual growth, reveal something important about the survival strategy of many lineages. Fast growth rates mean shorter juvenile periods, which means less time spent at the small body sizes that make an animal most vulnerable to the widest range of predators. The evidence from bone histology across many dinosaur lineages shows growth rates that, in some cases, rival those of modern birds and mammals, the fastest-growing vertebrates alive today. A dinosaur that grew quickly was a dinosaur that moved through the most dangerous phase of its life with the most speed, and the evolutionary selection for fast growth in lineages where juvenile mortality was high would have been strong. The size that an adult dinosaur reached was not achieved slowly over decades the way a crocodile grows. In many lineages, it was achieved in years, and the pace of that growth was itself a survival strategy. The question of whether large predatory dinosaurs were primarily active hunters or primarily scavengers of already dead animals is one that has been debated in the literature, and that the evidence taken as a whole resolves in the direction of active hunting for most lineages, with scavenging as an opportunistic supplement rather than a primary strategy. The arguments for obligate scavenging in large predatory dinosaurs were based on calculations of how much carrion a large predator would need to find per day to meet its energy requirements, and on comparisons with modern scavengers. The arguments against it pointed to the evidence of healed predation wounds on prey animals, which implies that the prey animal survived the attack, which implies that the attack was made on a living animal, and to the biomechanical evidence of acute sensory systems and agile locomotion in predatory lineages that exceeds what a scavenger that waits for things to die would require. The consensus that has emerged is that most large predatory dinosaurs were active hunters that also scavenged when the opportunity presented itself, in the same way that most large modern predators do. The mechanics of how large predatory dinosaurs actually attacked and subdued prey has been one of the most actively researched questions in paleontology over the past 3 decades, and the answers that have emerged from biomechanical analysis of skulls, teeth, and limbs are sometimes surprising. The teeth of predatory dinosaurs were not uniform across lineages. Some lineages had teeth with serrated edges, like steak knives, optimized for slicing through flesh and producing wounds that bled heavily. Others had more conical, less serrated teeth, better suited to gripping and holding struggling prey. Some had teeth that varied along the jaw with different shapes in different positions, performing different functions in the sequence of a kill. The variation in tooth morphology across predatory dinosaur lineages is evidence of the variation in their hunting strategies, each adapted to the specific prey and the specific environmental context of the lineage in question. The limb proportions of predatory dinosaurs carry information about their locomotor capabilities and therefore about what kind of pursuit was possible. Long legs relative to body size, and specifically long lower leg bones relative to upper leg bones, are associated with high running speed and maneuverability in modern running animals. Short, robust limbs are associated with strength and stability rather than speed. The variation in limb proportions across predatory dinosaur lineages spans this range, from lineages whose proportions suggest high speed and active pursuit to lineages whose proportions suggest ambush and power rather than chase and endurance. The ecological diversity of predatory strategies in the Mesozoic was as great as the ecological diversity of predatory strategies in any modern fauna. The seasonal rhythms of the Mesozoic world imposed specific survival challenges that varied by latitude and by the particular climate conditions of different periods. In environments with pronounced wet and dry seasons, the transition to the dry season brought a reduction in plant productivity and a concentration of animals around diminishing water sources that changed the competitive landscape dramatically. Animals that could migrate to track the availability of food and water had an advantage over those that could not, and there is evidence from trackway sites and from bone beds that some dinosaur communities engaged in large-scale seasonal movements that parallel the migrations of modern large animals. The trigger for these movements, the specific environmental cues that initiated them, is not preserved in the fossil record, but the pattern of the movements themselves is visible in the distribution of their remains and in the trackways that record their passage through specific landscapes at specific seasons. The defensive armor that some plant-eating dinosaur lineages developed represents one of the most visually dramatic examples of the predator-prey arms race in the Mesozoic fossil record. Bony plates embedded in the skin, called osteoderms, provided passive protection against the teeth and claws of predators in lineages that relied on this strategy. Tail clubs of fused bone, capable of delivering strikes with enough force to break bone, provided active defensive capability for the animals that possessed them. Horns and frills whose function has been debated extensively, with interpretations ranging from pure defense to species recognition to sexual display, added to the repertoire of structures that some lineages produced in the context of the predator-prey dynamic. The energy cost of growing and maintaining all of this bony armor was real, paid from the same caloric budget that fueled everything else the animal did. The cost was worth paying only in environments where predation pressure was high enough to justify it. And the distribution of armored lineages across the Mesozoic fossil record is consistent with the prediction that armor is most elaborated in the ecosystems with the most formidable predators. The feeding ecology of omnivorous dinosaur lineages, those that ate both plant material and animal material depending on availability and opportunity, adds a dimension to the Mesozoic food web that the simple predator-plant-eater dichotomy misses. Omnivores in modern ecosystems are often highly adaptable animals that can shift their diet in response to seasonal changes in food availability, taking advantage of insect abundances, fruit crops, and small vertebrate populations as each becomes available in sequence across the year. The evidence for dietary flexibility in some Mesozoic dinosaur lineages includes the gut contents preserved in exceptional fossil specimens and the analysis of tooth wear patterns that reflects the mechanical properties of the material the teeth were processing. An omnivorous dinosaur in a seasonally variable Mesozoic environment was not simply a generalist. It was an animal whose dietary flexibility was itself a survival strategy, buffering it against the fluctuations in any single food source that the seasons imposed. The plant-eating dinosaurs, which represented the majority of large-bodied dinosaur biomass in most Mesozoic ecosystems, faced a version of the survival challenge that was different in its specifics from the predators but no less demanding. For a plant-eater, the primary challenge beyond avoiding predators was obtaining enough food to fuel a body that, in some lineages, reached masses of tens of tons. A large plant-eating dinosaur needed to consume an extraordinary volume of vegetation every day to maintain its mass and support its metabolic needs, and the efficiency with which it processed that vegetation determined how much time it needed to spend feeding, which in turn determined how much time it was exposed to the risks that feeding in open areas or in dense vegetation created. The teeth of plant-eating dinosaur lineages reflect the diversity of plant material they processed. Some lineages had batteries of closely packed grinding teeth, hundreds of teeth working together as a single surface that could process tough, fibrous plant material with a thoroughness that simple leaf-eating teeth could not match. Others had simpler teeth suited to softer vegetation. Others had no teeth at all, processing plant material with a horny beak that could crop vegetation efficiently without the investment of growing and replacing teeth. The variation in dental equipment across plant-eating lineages reflects the variation in the plant communities they fed on and the variation in the processing demands of different plant types, with harder, tougher plants requiring more elaborate processing equipment than softer, more nutritious ones. The question of how large plant-eating dinosaurs dealt with the energy requirements of very large body size is one that has generated significant research in the last 2 decades. The caloric density of the conifer needles and fern fronds that formed the basis of many Mesozoic plant communities is not high, and the volume of this material that a very large animal would need to process per day is very large. The digestive systems of large plant-eating dinosaurs were likely extensive, with long intestinal tracts and possibly fermentation chambers that allowed more complete extraction of nutrients from tough plant material. The stones found in the rib cages of some specimens, called gastroliths, have been interpreted by some researchers as tools for mechanical processing of plant material within the digestive system, though the interpretation remains debated. What is not debated is that very large bodies require very large energy inputs, and the food-finding behavior of very large plant-eating dinosaurs must have been organized substantially around meeting this requirement. The water requirements of large dinosaurs were also substantial, and the need to find water regularly would have organized the ranging behavior of many dinosaur communities around the distribution of water sources in the landscape. In the seasonal environments that characterized many parts of the Mesozoic world, the dry season reduction of available water would have concentrated animals around remaining sources in ways that increased both competitive interactions between animals of the same species and predation risk, as predators and prey were forced into closer proximity by the scarcity that affected all of them. The fossil sites that preserve large concentrations of bones from multiple individuals of the same or different species are sometimes interpreted as the result of these seasonal concentrations, communities of animals that were forced together by water scarcity and that died together, their bones accumulating in sediments that preserved the evidence of the concentration. The escape behaviors of prey animals are documented in the fossil record in several indirect ways. Trackways, the preserved footprints of moving animals, sometimes capture predator and prey in what appears to be a pursuit, with the spacing of the prey animal's footprints suggesting the longer stride of a running gait. The musculature reconstructed from the attachment points on limb bones suggests the leg power available for sudden acceleration in some lineages, the kind of explosive first few steps that determine whether a prey animal creates enough separation from a predator to survive the initial attack. The herding behavior that some lineages appear to have engaged in, inferred from bone beds containing multiple individuals of the same species apparently dying together, would have provided the same benefits to prey animals that herding provides today. More eyes and ears monitoring the environment for predators, and the dilution effect that places any individual animal in a group at lower risk of being the one selected for attack. The relationship between predator and prey in any ecosystem is not simply one of hunter and hunted. It is a continuous co-evolutionary interaction in which each improvement in predator capability selects for improvements in prey defensive capability, and each improvement in prey defense selects for improvements in predator attack. This arms race dynamic, which operates across evolutionary time rather than within individual lifetimes, is one of the forces that drove the diversification of both predatory and defensive adaptations across the Mesozoic. The armor that some lineages developed, the horns and frills and tail clubs and osteoderms that the fossil record preserves, are the record of this evolutionary arms race written in bone. The offensive weapons that predatory lineages developed, the serrated teeth and the powerful limbs and the specialized jaw mechanics, are the other side of the same record. What the Mesozoic predator-prey dynamic produced, across 165 million years of continuous co-evolution, was a world in which survival was never guaranteed and never easy, in which every adaptation had a counter-adaptation, and in which the specific form of that difficulty varied by ecosystem, by season, by the particular community of animals a given individual found itself in. The daily life inside this world was not the dramatic event that highlight footage would suggest. It was the ordinary struggle of living things to stay alive and to find enough to eat, conducted in the specific conditions of a world that was alien in its physical details and recognizable in its fundamental dynamic. The next part goes deeper into what that daily life actually looked like at the level of the individual animal, in the social world it inhabited. The role of small dinosaurs in Mesozoic ecosystems is one that popular accounts consistently underrepresent in favor of the large and the dramatic. Small dinosaurs occupied a range of ecological niches that included insectivory, small vertebrate predation, seed and fruit eating, and scavenging. Niches that in any functioning ecosystem represent the majority of individual animals, even when the large animals attract the most attention. The small predatory dinosaurs that fed on insects, small mammals, lizards, and early birds were abundant components of most Mesozoic ecosystems, and their ecological impact on the populations of their prey was probably as significant as the impact of the large predators on the large plant eaters that most easily catch the human eye. The energy flow through an ecosystem moves primarily through the small and the numerous, not through the large and the spectacular, and the Mesozoic was no exception. The nocturnal and crepuscular niches in Mesozoic ecosystems were occupied by animals that the fossil record documents less thoroughly than it documents the large diurnal forms, but that the ecological logic of a functioning ecosystem makes necessary. Some dinosaur lineages had enlarged eyes relative to skull size, consistent with investment in low-light vision that would have supported activity in the hours of dawn, dusk, or darkness. The early mammals that coexisted with the dinosaurs throughout the Mesozoic were primarily small nocturnal animals that exploited the ecological space not occupied by the diurnal dinosaurs, and the nocturnality of these early mammals was partly a consequence of the predation pressure from dinosaurs that drove their evolutionary radiation into the night. The nocturnal world of the Mesozoic was not empty. It was full of smaller animals navigating their own version of the survival challenge in the dark, while the large diurnal animals were resting. The bite force evidence preserved in the dental and cranial anatomy of predatory dinosaur lineages has been analyzed using biomechanical models that combine bone dimensions, muscle attachment areas, and the material properties of bone to estimate the forces that the jaws were capable of producing. The results span a remarkable range, from lineages with relatively modest bite forces optimized for rapid slicing, to lineages with crushing forces that exceed those of any modern land predator. The functional implications of these different bite force regimes are significant. A high bite force is useful for crushing bone to access marrow, for subduing large struggling prey, and for dismembering carcasses efficiently. A lower bite force with sharp slicing teeth is useful for rapid killing of prey through hemorrhage rather than crushing, and for efficient processing of flesh in the quick feeding that competitive carcass access often requires. The diversity of jaw mechanics across predatory lineages reflects the diversity of their specific hunting and feeding strategies. The evidence of healed injuries in dinosaur specimens is some of the most direct and poignant evidence of what survival in the Mesozoic actually cost individual animals. A bone that was broken and then healed is a bone that belonged to an animal that survived an injury serious enough to break a bone, continued to live after that injury, and healed well enough to resume normal function. The healing is documented in the remodeling of bone tissue around the original injury site, visible in cross-sections of the bone under a microscope. The frequency of healed injuries in populations of dinosaurs from well-sampled fossil sites suggests that injury was common, that survival of serious injury was possible, and that the animals that survived injury were robust enough to continue contributing to the population. The animal with the healed bone in its leg was not the weakest member of its population. It was the one that survived something that would have killed an animal with less resilience, less behavioral adaptability, or less social support from conspecifics who might have buffered the costs of its temporary incapacity. The predators and prey of the Mesozoic existed in ecosystems that were structured in ways that the fossil record is only beginning to allow us to reconstruct in quantitative terms. The relative abundances of different species in a fossil fauna, the size structure of predator and prey communities, the ratios of predator biomass to prey biomass, all of these carry information about how the ecosystem functioned and what the daily encounters between different components of the food web actually looked like. Early work in Mesozoic paleoecology often treated the fossil record as a list of species present in a formation, with less attention to their relative abundances and ecological relationships. More recent work, using more rigorous sampling and quantitative analysis, has begun to reconstruct something closer to the actual ecological structure of specific Mesozoic communities, producing pictures of these communities that are more useful for understanding what life in them actually involved. The transition from the daily activity of the individual animal to the long-term dynamics of the population it belonged to is where the survival challenge of the Mesozoic ultimately played out. Individual animals lived and died in the context of their own survival challenges. Populations persisted or went extinct in the context of the long-term environmental changes that the Mesozoic imposed. A lineage that survived the end Triassic extinction, diversified through the Jurassic, adapted to the changing plant communities of the Cretaceous, and then was eliminated in the final extinction event, had navigated 165 million years of continuous environmental change at the population level, while the individuals within it lived and died on timescales of years or decades. The survival challenge is real at both scales simultaneously, and the Mesozoic is long enough that both scales are visible in its fossil record if you know where to look. The Mesozoic food web extended into the water in ways that made the boundary between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems a zone of particular ecological productivity and particular danger. The rivers and lakes and coastal wetlands of the Mesozoic were inhabited by large aquatic predators, including the crocodilian ancestors that have persisted to the present day, that preyed on dinosaurs and other large terrestrial animals that came to drink or that ventured into shallow water. The bone beds associated with ancient river channels and flood deposits sometimes contain the remains of both aquatic and terrestrial animals mixed together in ways that reflect the fatal encounters that occurred at the interface between these two environments. An animal coming to the water's edge in the Mesozoic was navigating a transition between two predator communities, the terrestrial community it was already part of and the aquatic community that it was entering the territory of. And the animals that did this successfully had behavioral adaptations for reading the specific risks of the water's edge that the animals which did not survive lacked. The daily experience of a dinosaur moving through its environment was shaped by information that came in continuously from every sensory channel, and the animal's ability to integrate this information and respond to it quickly enough to matter determined whether it survived each hour. The smell of a predator on the wind, the sound of movement in vegetation that should not be moving, the visual detection of something the right size and the right shape, moving at the wrong speed. Any of these could trigger the cascade of physiological responses that prepared the animal for fight or flight, and the speed and accuracy of that response determined whether the predator got close enough to matter. The neuroscience of what a dinosaur experienced in a moment of threat is not something the fossil record preserves, but the anatomy of the sensory organs and the brain regions that process their inputs constrains what we can infer about the speed and the character of these responses. The animals were not slow, they were not torpid, they were alive in the full sense that any animal under predation pressure is alive, which is acutely, in every moment, with the specific quality of attention that the possibility of death at any time produces. The survival story of the Mesozoic is ultimately the story of what the physical conditions and the ecological pressures of 165 million years of continuous change produced in the bodies and behaviors of the animals that navigated them. The serrated tooth and the armored flank and the fast leg and the wide eye were all solutions to problems that the world posed, shaped over generations by the differential survival of the animals whose solutions worked better than the alternatives. The world that produced these solutions is gone. The solutions themselves are partially preserved in the fossil record, waiting to be read by the people patient enough to spend their careers in museum collections and field sites extracting the information that the rock has kept. What the next part examines is not the survival challenge in its physical dimension, but in its social one. The evidence that Mesozoic dinosaurs were not simply solitary survivors, but animals with social lives, behavioral complexity, and in some cases the kind of parental investment that fundamentally changes what being alive in that world meant. The skin of dinosaurs is preserved in enough exceptional fossil specimens to give us a real, If incomplete, picture of what the exterior of these animals looked like. Fossilized skin impressions, sometimes called mummified dinosaurs when the preservation is extensive, show scale textures, skin fold patterns, and in some cases, color-relevant structures that modern analysis techniques are beginning to interpret. The discovery that many small-bodied and juvenile dinosaur lineages bore feathers or feather-like structures, preserved in specimens from exceptionally fine-grained deposits that retain soft tissue detail, fundamentally changed the popular image of what a dinosaur looked like. The scaly, reptilian animal of earlier reconstructions was not wrong for all lineages, but it was wrong for enough of them that the revision was substantial. A Mesozoic landscape populated by both heavily scaled large animals and feathered small to medium animals would have had a visual character very different from any modern landscape, and the function of feathers in lineages too large to fly, as insulation, as display structures, as behavioral signaling tools, reflects the same range of functions that feathers serve in the birds that inherited them. The image of the dinosaur as a solitary, cold, and cognitively simple animal that moved through its world on instinct alone has been one of the most persistent and most thoroughly revised assumptions in the history of paleontology. The revision began with the fossil record and has been extended by everything that research on the living descendants of dinosaurs, the birds, has revealed about what the ancestral behavioral repertoire of the lineage was likely to have contained. What has emerged from this revision is not the simple correction of one wrong picture with one right one, but a more complex and more interesting story about the diversity of social and behavioral strategies that different dinosaur lineages employed across 165 million years of evolution in environments as varied as the world has ever contained. The nesting behavior of dinosaurs is one of the behavioral domains where the fossil record is most informative, because nests, eggs, and in some exceptional cases, the remains of adults in postures consistent with brooding have been preserved in enough detail to allow real inferences about how reproduction was managed in specific lineages. Fossil nests have been found on every continent in geological formations representing different periods of the Mesozoic, associated with different dinosaur lineages that managed reproduction in different ways. The diversity of nest structures, from simple scraped-out depressions in the ground to organized clutches of eggs arranged in patterns, and the diversity of egg sizes and shell structures reflect the diversity of reproductive strategies across the dinosaur lineage. Subscribe before we go any further. Drop a comment right now telling us where you are in the world and what time it is there. We want to know. The discovery of nesting colonies in several Mesozoic formations, sites where multiple individuals of the same species nested in close proximity year after year, was one of the pieces of evidence that most fundamentally changed the picture of dinosaur social behavior. A nesting colony is not the behavior of an asocial animal. It requires individuals to tolerate the close presence of conspecifics during the most vulnerable period of their reproductive cycle, to manage conflicts over nest space, and in at least some cases to coordinate defensive responses to threats that approach the colony. The nesting colonies documented in the Mesozoic fossil record are not as elaborate as the seabird colonies of modern coastlines, but their existence implies a level of social tolerance and social organization that the solitary animal model could not accommodate. The eggs themselves carry information about the physiology and the reproductive biology of the animals that produced them. Eggshell chemistry and microstructure can be analyzed to determine the temperature at which the eggs incubated, which constrains what kind of nest environment the parents were providing. The organization of eggs within a clutch, which in some species shows a pattern consistent with the female having laid eggs from two oviducts simultaneously in a rotating pattern, tells us something about the anatomy of the reproductive system. The size of the egg relative to the size of the adult tells us something about the developmental state of the hatchling, whether it emerged as a relatively independent animal or as a dependent one requiring extended parental care. The variation in egg characteristics across lineages reflects the variation in reproductive strategies, with some lineages producing large numbers of small eggs suggesting lower investment per offspring, and others producing smaller clutches of larger eggs, suggesting higher investment and presumably more parental attention per individual. The evidence for parental care in specific dinosaur lineages, beyond the evidence of nesting, includes exceptional fossil specimens that preserve adults and juveniles in spatial relationships consistent with care behavior, and bone histology evidence that shows patterns of growth consistent with extended juvenile dependency. The picture that has emerged from this evidence is not that all dinosaurs provided intensive parental care in the way that modern birds do, but that parental care varied across lineages in ways that probably reflected the developmental state of the hatchlings and the ecological context of each lineage. Lineages with relatively precocial hatchlings, babies that emerged from the egg capable of substantial independent activity, may have required less intensive postnatal care than lineages with altricial hatchlings that emerged helpless and dependent. The variation in developmental strategy across dinosaur lineages parallels the variation seen in modern birds and reptiles, and the fossil record is beginning to allow us to map that variation across the dinosaur family tree. The specific evidence from one of the most celebrated nesting sites in the Mesozoic fossil record illustrates what the combination of preserved nests, eggs, embryos, hatchlings, juveniles, and adults can reveal about a single species' reproductive biology when exceptional preservation conditions allow the full reproductive sequence to be documented in a single location. At such sites, the spatial distribution of nests across the nesting ground, the consistency of nest spacing across multiple nesting seasons recorded in the sedimentary layers, and the size distribution of individuals present all carry information about the social organization of the nesting colony and the reproductive behavior of the adults. The evidence from the best-preserved nesting sites in the Mesozoic has been used to infer that some lineages returned to the same nesting locations in successive years, maintained spacing between nests consistent with territorial behavior within the colony, and produced hatchlings that remained in or near the nest for extended periods before becoming independent. This is a behavioral profile that resembles the colonial nesting behavior of modern seabirds and colonial waterbirds more closely than it resembles the asocial egg-laying of modern reptiles. The embryos preserved inside fossil eggs are among the most informative specimens in Mesozoic paleontology because they record the developmental state of the animal at a specific and known point in its life history. The bone development visible in embryonic specimens tells researchers how far along skeletal ossification was at the time of hatching, which is one of the primary indicators of how precocial or altricial the hatchling was likely to have been. Embryos from some lineages show relatively advanced ossification at the time they were preserved, suggesting that hatchlings from these eggs were born in a relatively independent state, capable of locomotion and possibly of self-feeding within hours or days of emergence. Embryos from other lineages show much less advanced ossification, suggesting hatchlings that were small, helpless, and dependent on parental care for food and protection for an extended period. The variation in developmental state at hatching is one of the clearest indicators of the variation in parental investment strategies across dinosaur lineages. The footprint record of dinosaur behavior, the trace fossil evidence that records movements and activities rather than the animals' bodies themselves, preserves evidence of social behavior that is complementary to the body fossil evidence, and that sometimes captures aspects of behavior that body fossils cannot. Trackways from many individuals of the same species moving in the same direction, with tracks of different sizes intermixed in a way consistent with adults and juveniles traveling together, have been interpreted as evidence of family groups or social herds that included animals of multiple age classes. The spacing between individual trackways in some herding trackway sites is consistent with animals maintaining a specific spatial relationship to each other, not simply moving in the same direction, but actively coordinating their positions in a way that requires each animal to be monitoring the behavior of its neighbors. The social awareness that this coordination implies is the same social awareness that makes herding effective as a defensive strategy. The communication systems of dinosaurs are among the aspects of their biology most difficult to reconstruct from the fossil record, because behavior generally leaves no direct fossil evidence. What the anatomy of the sound-producing and sound-receiving systems can tell us is what kinds of sounds the animals were capable of making and detecting, which constrains what their communication could have been. The inner ear structure of dinosaurs, preserved in some exceptional specimens, suggests hearing capabilities in the range relevant for the calls and vocalizations of animals of their body size. The absence of a tympanic membrane in the external ear anatomy of some lineages suggests that they may have detected sounds through the bones of the skull and jaw in a way that is different from, but analogous to, the bone conduction hearing that modern crocodilians and some lizards use. The crests and elaborate head structures found in some dinosaur lineages have been one of the most debated subjects in Mesozoic paleontology, with interpretations ranging from species recognition displays to sexual selection signals to resonating chambers for sound production. The resonating chamber hypothesis, which proposes that the hollow internal structure of some crests functioned as an acoustic amplifier for vocalizations produced in the nasal passages, has been supported by computational models that show the crests would have produced resonance at frequencies consistent with the communication range of large animals. If this hypothesis is correct, the crest structures of these lineages were not merely visual signals but acoustic instruments, giving their owners a vocal capability that the surrounding fauna could detect at greater distances than an uncombined vocal system would allow. The behavioral implications of such a system, the ability to maintain acoustic contact across distances that exceed the visual range in forested environments, are significant for any animal whose survival depended on coordination with conspecifics. The thermoregulatory behavior that dinosaurs likely employed, based on what is known about the physiology of their living relatives and from the isotopic evidence of their body temperatures, would have been a significant component of their daily activity patterns. Animals that maintained elevated body temperatures through metabolic heat production needed to manage heat loss in cool conditions and heat gain in hot conditions, behaviors that are visible in modern birds and reptiles in the forms of shade-seeking sunbasking, huddling, and the specific timing of activity relative to the daily temperature cycle. The orientation of nests in some well-preserved nesting sites is consistent with positioning for optimal solar heating of the eggs, suggesting that nest placement was not random but was influenced by the thermal requirements of incubation. The behavioral flexibility required to optimize these thermoregulatory decisions was not trivial, and the evidence that it was exercised adds to the picture of behaviorally sophisticated animals managing multiple environmental challenges simultaneously. The play behavior that might have characterized juvenile dinosaurs, though it leaves almost no direct fossil record, is inferred from the anatomy of juvenile specimens and from comparison with living relatives. Modern birds and crocodilians, the living descendants and closest living relatives of dinosaurs respectively, both engage in play behavior during juvenile development, and the functions of this play, practicing motor skills, developing social bonds, and acquiring behavioral knowledge in a low-stakes context, are functions that would have been equally valuable for dinosaurs whose adult lives required complex motor and social skills. The bone beds that preserve large numbers of juvenile individuals dying together, sometimes interpreted as the result of group juvenile mortality events such as floods, are at least consistent with juveniles that spent time in social groups where play and other social learning behaviors would have been possible and functional. The intelligence of dinosaurs is a topic that has been revised substantially as research on their brain anatomy has improved. The brain-to-body size ratios of non-avian dinosaurs were generally lower than those of modern birds and mammals, a fact that was once interpreted as evidence of low cognitive capability. More recent analysis has highlighted the inadequacy of simple brain-to-body ratio as a measure of cognitive capability and has focused instead on the specific organization of the brain, the relative development of different regions, and the comparison with living relatives whose behavioral capabilities are known. The cerebellum, which is involved in motor coordination and is particularly well developed in animals with complex locomotor demands, is proportionally large in many dinosaur lineages, consistent with the complex locomotion of bipedal and quadrupedal animals moving through varied terrain. The regions associated with sensory processing are also well developed, consistent with the evidence from sense organ anatomy that smell and vision were primary information channels. The regions associated with the highest cognitive functions in modern birds, which are the dinosaurian descendants with the most elaborate cognitive capabilities, are less clearly homologous to specific brain regions in non-avian dinosaurs, making direct comparison difficult. But the trajectory from the non-avian dinosaur brain to the avian brain, visible in the sequence of intermediate fossils that the bird lineage has now produced, shows a continuous increase in the complexity of the regions associated with behavioral flexibility and social cognition across the lineage's evolutionary history. The visual display behaviors of dinosaurs are inferred from the elaborate structures that many lineages developed on their heads, necks, backs, and tails. Structures whose anatomy is more consistent with display function than with any purely defensive or purely thermoregulatory purpose. The elaborate frills and horns of ceratopsian lineages, the sail structures of some large predatory lineages, the elaborate bony crests and knobs of various herbivorous groups, all of these have been interpreted as visual signals used in intraspecific communication, whether for mate attraction, rival assessment, species recognition, or some combination of these functions. The color of these structures cannot be directly preserved in most fossil specimens, but the presence of melanosomes, the cellular structures that produce pigment, in some exceptionally preserved specimens, has allowed researchers to begin reconstructing the color patterns of specific animals with a precision that was impossible a generation ago. The Mesozoic was not the gray and brown world of older reconstructions. It contained animals whose visual signaling was likely as elaborate and as colorful as the visual signaling of modern birds, which are, after all, the living expression of the same evolutionary lineage. The migration patterns of dinosaur communities are inferred from several lines of evidence that converge on the conclusion that large-scale seasonal movements were a feature of some dinosaur populations in some environments. Isotopic analysis of bone and tooth material can detect changes in the water chemistry that the animal was drinking across its lifetime, and isotopic signatures that shift in a way consistent with movement between geographically distinct water sources provide evidence of migration. The distribution of fossils across geological formations can show patterns consistent with seasonal presence in specific environments, with the same species appearing in some formations only in the deposits associated with specific seasons. The trackway evidence, where large numbers of tracks from the same species moving in the same direction are preserved in the same formation, provides the most direct evidence of coordinated movement, though the interpretation of these trackways as migration, rather than some other form of directed movement, requires additional contextual evidence. The flocking or herding behavior of some dinosaur lineages, inferred from bone beds that preserve large numbers of individuals of the same species dying together, and from trackway sites that preserve the footprints of many individuals moving in coordinated groups, has implications for the social complexity of these lineages that go beyond the simple observation that they tolerated each other's presence. A herd is not simply a group of animals in the same place at the same time. It is a social structure that requires individual animals to maintain spatial relationships with each other, to respond to the movement and behavior of conspecifics in coordinated ways, and to produce collective responses to threats that are more effective than individual responses would be. The cognitive demands of herding behavior are real, and the evidence that some dinosaur lineages met these demands is direct and substantial. The dominance hierarchies that many social animal species maintain are not directly visible in the fossil record, but they leave indirect evidence in the form of injuries and skeletal anomalies consistent with intraspecific combat. The elaborate head and neck structures of many ceratopsian species, interpreted as jousting or shoving organs for male-male competition in some models, have been compared to the antlers of modern deer and the horns of modern bovids, structures whose primary function is male-male competition for reproductive access. If this interpretation is correct, the dominance hierarchies of ceratopsian populations involved ritualized physical competition between males with specialized weapons, a pattern that is common enough in modern animals to be considered a standard feature of social species with high reproductive skew. The broken and healed bones in the frills and horns of some ceratopsian specimens are consistent with this interpretation. The learning behaviors that can be inferred from the anatomy and the developmental trajectory of dinosaur lineages suggest that at least some groups were capable of the kind of behavioral flexibility that requires learning from experience and from conspecifics. The long developmental periods documented in some lineages, extended periods of juvenile dependency, during which the young animal was in close contact with adults whose behavior it could observe, create the conditions for social learning that the behavioral complexity of these lineages probably required. An animal that migrates with a herd needs to learn the migration routes, the water sources along the way, the timing of the seasonal movements. An animal that participates in coordinated group defense needs to learn the signals that initiate defensive responses and the behavioral roles that different individuals play in the defense. None of this is learned from instinct alone. It is learned from experience, from observation, and from the social context that the group provides. What the evidence from fossil nests and parental care and communication structures and herding behavior and migration patterns adds up to is a picture of dinosaur social life that is recognizably continuous with the social lives of their living descendants. The birds of the modern world are not a departure from the ancestral dinosaurian social pattern. They are the most elaborate and most diverse expression of social and behavioral tendencies that were present in the lineage from its earliest stages, expressed in the specific forms that the specific ecological contexts of each lineage shaped. The behavioral richness of the Mesozoic world was not hidden or absent. It was there, running continuously in the same world that the rocks and the climate and the predators were running in, shaping the lives of every dinosaur that moved through it. The final part of this series looks at how that world ended and at what it left behind. The relationship between dinosaur social behavior and the specific plant communities they inhabited is one that researchers have begun to explore as a way of understanding why different social strategies were more common in some environments than others. Dense forest environments, where individual animals cannot maintain visual contact over long distances, favor communication systems that work through vegetation, which means acoustic and chemical signals rather than visual ones. Open environments, where visual contact is possible over hundreds of meters, favor visual display and visual threat assessment between individuals. The transition from the dense conifer forests of the early Mesozoic to the more varied and in some areas more open plant communities of the Cretaceous, driven by the diversification of flowering plants, may have created new ecological contexts for the evolution of social behaviors that were not possible or not effective in the earlier, denser forest environments. The diversity of body sizes across dinosaur lineages, which spans from animals smaller than a pigeon to animals that were the largest land animals that have ever lived, created a community structure in which the social dynamics of each size class operated partly independently of the others and partly in interaction with them. The very largest plant-eating dinosaurs were too large for the predators of their environment to take as adults, and the social dynamics of these adults were primarily intraspecific, organized around access to food, mates, and resting areas among conspecifics of their own enormous size class. The juveniles of these same species were vulnerable to a much wider range of predators, and the transition from the vulnerable juvenile size class to the effectively invulnerable adult size class was one of the most important life history transitions in the biology of these lineages. How the social behavior of juveniles differed from the social behavior of adults in these lineages is not clearly preserved in the fossil record, but the difference in predation risk and therefore in the adaptive value of different social strategies was large enough that different social behaviors in the two age classes would not be surprising. The most recent period of active dinosaur research has produced discoveries that have repeatedly expanded what was thought to be possible in Mesozoic animal behavior. The recognition that feathered dinosaurs use their feathers in display behaviors analogous to those of modern birds added a visual richness to the Mesozoic behavioral landscape that earlier reconstructions lacked. The discovery that some dinosaur lineages had complex color vision, based on the visual pigment genes preserved in exceptional specimens, suggested that the visual signals they produced were perceived with a precision that their elaborate structures would have required to be effective. The evidence for parental behavior in multiple lineages, accumulated across decades of fieldwork on every continent, has shifted the consensus from the assumption of reptilian indifference to offspring to the recognition that extended parental investment was present in at least some dinosaur communities from early in the era's history. What we know about how dinosaurs behaved is far more than what any researcher in the early 20th century would have thought possible to recover from fossils, and the pace of discovery has not slowed. The use of isotopic analysis to reconstruct the diet of specific dinosaur individuals, rather than inferring diet from tooth shape alone, has produced some results that complicated earlier assumptions. Carbon isotopes in tooth enamel and bone collagen preserve a record of the isotopic composition of the food the animal ate, which in turn reflects the types of plants that were available and consumed in the specific environment the animal inhabited. This analysis has confirmed that many plant-eating lineages were generalists that shifted their diet seasonally with the availability of different plant types, rather than specialists committed to a single food source year-round. The dietary flexibility that isotopic evidence suggests in some lineages adds to the picture of behaviorally adaptable animals that tracked the variability of their environment with more sophistication than a simple morphological assessment of their feeding apparatus would imply. The evidence for disease in dinosaur populations adds a social dimension that is easy to overlook. In modern social animals, disease transmission between individuals is one of the costs of group living, and the behaviors that reduce transmission risk, avoidance of visibly ill individuals, maintenance of spatial distance from sick group members, alteration of grooming behavior, are well documented. There is no direct evidence of these disease avoidance behaviors in dinosaurs, but the presence of diseases that could have spread between social animals, inferred from bone pathologies consistent with infectious disease in some specimens, implies that the social animals that lived with these diseases were exposed to selective pressures favoring behaviors that reduced transmission. The social costs and social benefits of group living in dinosaur communities were as real as they are in modern social animals, and the balance between them shaped the social structures that the fossil record documents. The reproductive competition between males that the elaborate display structures of many lineages imply created the conditions for the evolution of the same kinds of male-male assessment behavior that modern animals with similar structures display. The ritualized combat that modern bovids with horns, deer with antlers, and birds with elaborate display plumage engage in, combat that involves the use of the display structure in a way that communicates competitive ability without necessarily producing lethal injury, is the behavioral context in which these structures evolved and are maintained. The healed injuries on the display structures of some dinosaur specimens suggest that the combat was sometimes real and physical rather than purely ritualized, consistent with what modern studies of animal combat show. That ritualized assessment reduces but does not eliminate the incidence of escalated physical confrontation. The social world that these competitive dynamics created, with individuals assessing each other continuously and adjusting their behavior based on those assessments, was a world of ongoing social calculation that the brain required to run it had to be able to manage. The final thing the behavioral evidence adds to the picture of Mesozoic life is the dimension of individuality. Each dinosaur that left a trace in the fossil record was an individual animal with its own history, its own injuries, its own growth trajectory, its own social relationships. The specimen with the healed leg fracture had a life that included the injury and the survival of it and whatever changed in the years that followed. The adult preserved on a nest was an individual that had made the journey to that nesting location, had constructed or selected that specific nest, had laid those specific eggs, and had been present at the nest when whatever ended its life there happened. The fossil is a preserved moment in an individual life, and the individual life was full of the same unpredictability and the same specificity that any life contains. Knowing this does not change what the fossil tells us scientifically, but it changes how we hold what we learn from it, and that change of relationship to the material is part of what the best paleontology produces. The next part closes the story at its largest scale. The social complexity that the evidence points toward in at least some dinosaur lineages does not require us to attribute to these animals the same kind of reflective consciousness that humans have, or even the rich emotional and social inner life that we attribute to living great apes. What it requires is that we recognize that complex social behavior, coordinated group action, parental investment, display and assessment in competitive contexts, and the learning and cultural transmission that these behaviors require are not exclusive features of large-brained modern vertebrates. They are features that have evolved repeatedly in animal lineages whose cognitive architecture supported them, and the dinosaurian lineage, which has been producing birds with some of the most complex social and cognitive behaviors in the animal world for 66 million years, clearly had the cognitive foundations for social complexity well before the mass extinction that eliminated the non-avian forms. The behavioral richness of the Mesozoic is not an inference from optimism. It is a conclusion from evidence, growing with every new discovery, that the world before us was as full of living things doing complex things as the world we inhabit. The Mesozoic social world that the evidence reconstructs was not a world of isolated individuals moving through an empty landscape. It was a world populated by animals that knew each other, that had histories with each other, that communicated with each other through sounds and colors and movements and chemical signals, that raised their young in some cases with the kind of attentive care that produces the behavioral sophistication of modern birds, and that competed with each other for mates and resources in ways that drove the evolution of the elaborate structures and complex displays that the fossil record preserves. The social world of the Mesozoic is not fully recoverable from the material that remains. But what is recoverable is enough to make clear that it was there, that it was real, and that the animals who inhabited it were doing something more than simply surviving one day at a time. They were living. The final part looks at the end of that living and at what came after. 66 million years ago, in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, something arrived from space that ended the world. Not metaphorically, not gradually. The impact of an asteroid or comet approximately 10 to 15 kilometers across, traveling at speeds in excess of 20 kilometers per second, released an amount of energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons in the span of seconds. The immediate effects in the region of impact were total and instantaneous. Everything within hundreds of kilometers was destroyed by the shockwave, the heat, and the tsunami that the impact generated in the shallow sea that covered the area. The ejector thrown into the upper atmosphere by the impact circled the globe and re-entered as a rain of superheated material that, in the hours following the impact, may have raised the surface temperature of the land over much of the northern hemisphere enough to ignite widespread wildfires. The sky over a significant portion of Earth glowed. Then came the dark. Subscribe before we go any further. Drop a comment telling us where you are in the world and what time it is there. We want to know. The dust and sulfur compounds thrown into the stratosphere by the impact created a global screen that blocked sunlight. Not completely, not everywhere, and not forever, but substantially enough and for long enough to matter. The cooling that followed the initial heat was rapid by geological standards and catastrophic for the ecosystems that had evolved in the warmth of the Mesozoic. Plant productivity collapsed as photosynthesis was disrupted. The food chains that depended on plant productivity collapsed in sequence after it. The animals at the top of those food chains, the large consumers that required the most energy to sustain themselves, were the most vulnerable to the sudden reduction in the energy flowing through the systems they lived in. The larger you were, the more food you needed per day, and the more devastating the collapse of food availability was for your survival. The geological evidence for this sequence of events is preserved in the thin layer of sediment found at the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene periods in rock formations around the world. This layer, called the KPG boundary, contains high concentrations of iridium, an element rare in Earth's crust but common in asteroids, and shocked quartz, a form of quartz that is only produced by the extreme pressures of large impacts. It marks the moment, preserved in stone when the world changed. Below it, the Mesozoic, full of the diversity that 165 million years had produced. Above it, the world after, smaller and quieter, and still trying to understand what had happened to it. The extinction that the impact triggered was not the first mass extinction in Earth's history, and it was not the largest. The end Permian extinction 252 million years ago, eliminated an estimated 96% of all marine species and 70% of land vertebrate species. A catastrophe so complete that the recovery of global biodiversity took millions of years. The end Cretaceous extinction was smaller in its total scope, eliminating approximately 3/4 of all species on Earth. But its effect on the dominant large land animals of the Mesozoic was effectively total. The non-avian dinosaurs did not merely decline, they were gone entirely in a geological blink. The species that had defined large-bodied terrestrial life for over 160 million years were not present in the world that emerged after the boundary. What replaced them took tens of millions of years to produce the ecological complexity that the Mesozoic had sustained. And what replaced them was recognizable to us as the world we know because we evolved in it. The specific sequence of events in the years and decades following the impact has been reconstructed from multiple lines of geological and geochemical evidence, and the picture that has emerged is more nuanced than the simple winter follows impact narrative that early models proposed. The sulfur compounds released by the impact vaporizing the carbonate and sulfate rocks of the Yucatan seabed were particularly significant for the climate disruption because sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere produce cooling effects that last longer than the dust from the impact itself. The combination of impact dust and sulfate aerosols created a cooling that persisted for years, reducing average global temperatures by estimates that range from a few degrees to over 10 degrees Celsius in different models and in different parts of the world. The tropical and subtropical regions, where the most diverse ecosystems of the Mesozoic had flourished, experienced the most dramatic disruption because their ecosystems had been calibrated to the specific temperature and precipitation conditions of the warm Mesozoic and had the least physiological tolerance for the cold that the impact imposed. The acid rain that followed the impact, produced by the nitrogen oxides generated by the extreme heat of the impact event, reacting with atmospheric nitrogen and oxygen, and by the sulfur compounds from the vaporized rocks, added a chemical insult to the physical and thermal insults of the impact's immediate aftermath. The pH of precipitation across wide areas may have dropped enough to damage plant foliage, to acidify surface water bodies and harm aquatic life, and to leach nutrients from soils in ways that further reduced the productivity of already stressed terrestrial ecosystems. The sequence of stresses was not a single blow followed by recovery. It was a cascade, each disruption compounding the effects of the previous ones, and the cascade persisted long enough to eliminate the organisms that might otherwise have persisted through a shorter disruption. The recovery of global ecosystems after the end Cretaceous extinction took millions of years and proceeded at different rates in different parts of the world. Marine ecosystems, which were disrupted by the impact-induced acidification of surface waters and the collapse of the plankton productivity that forms the base of most marine food chains, began showing signs of recovery within hundreds of thousands of years as the most resilient survivors of the plankton communities rebuilt their populations and the food chains that depended on them began to function again. Terrestrial ecosystems recovered more slowly in the most heavily affected regions because the destruction of the existing plant community required the recolonization of denuded landscapes by whatever plant survivors remained, a process that proceeded outward from refugia that had escaped the worst of the impact's effects, and that took millions of years to produce something resembling the diversity that the Mesozoic had achieved. The survivors of the end Cretaceous extinction had several things in common that help explain why they made it through when the non-avian dinosaurs did not. Small body size was the most important single factor. Small animals need less food per day, can sustain themselves on a wider variety of food sources, and can survive on the reduced energy available from disrupted ecosystems longer than large animals can. The mammals that had been living in the shadow of the dinosaurs throughout the Mesozoic, mostly small, nocturnal, and insectivorous, had the small body sizes that the post-impact world favored. Some could dig burrows, protecting themselves from the immediate effects of the impact's thermal pulse and from the temperature fluctuations of the disrupted years that followed. Some were omnivorous enough to shift their diet to whatever the disrupted environment offered. Seeds, fungi, insects, dead organic matter, the resources that remained available when plant productivity collapsed. The birds, which had been diversifying through the Cretaceous as the most successful lineage of small feathered dinosaurs, passed through the extinction event with losses that were substantial, but not total. Most of the bird lineages present in the late Cretaceous did not survive. The ones that did, which are the ancestors of all living birds, appear to have been ground-dwelling, seed-eating forms that could sustain themselves on the seeds and other stored plant material that persisted in the soil after the collapse of fresh plant production. The survivors were not the most ecologically dominant or the most diverse of the Cretaceous bird lineages. They were the ones that happened to have the dietary and behavioral flexibility to persist through the years of reduced productivity that followed the impact. The birds that fill the world today, 10,000 species representing one of the most diverse vertebrate groups alive, are the descendants of a small number of ground-dwelling seed-eaters that made it through a darkness that eliminated everything else in their lineage. The crocodilians, which had been part of the archosaur lineage that produced the dinosaurs and which had coexisted with dinosaurs throughout the Mesozoic, survived the extinction with less reduction in their lineage diversity than the dinosaurs suffered. Their survival reflects the specific features of their biology that the post-impact environment favored. The ability to survive for long periods without food, which allows crocodilians to persist through periods of resource scarcity that would be fatal to animals with higher metabolic demands. The ability to use aquatic environments which were less severely disrupted by the loss of terrestrial plant productivity than terrestrial environments were, and omnivorous or generalist dietary habits that allowed flexibility in food sources when specific prey were unavailable. The turtles, the lizards, the snakes, the frogs, and the small mammals that survived the extinction share this common thread of small size, dietary flexibility, and in many cases the ability to enter dormancy or reduce metabolic demands during periods of food scarcity. The world that the extinction left behind was not empty. It was radically impoverished compared to the Mesozoic, and the ecological roles that had been filled by the large dinosaurian animals were vacant for millions of years before the surviving lineages evolved the size and the ecological diversity to fill them. The first large mammals appeared in the Paleogene, the period immediately following the extinction, and their diversification into the ecological niches vacated by the dinosaurs was one of the most rapid adaptive radiations in the history of life. But rapid in evolutionary terms means millions of years, and the world immediately after the extinction was a world of small animals in an ecosystem that had lost its largest components and had not yet grown replacements. The question of whether the non-avian dinosaurs were already in decline before the impact, or whether they were thriving up to the moment of the asteroid's arrival, has been one of the most actively debated in Mesozoic paleontology. The answer has significant implications for how we understand the extinction. Was it an event that eliminated a group already weakened by earlier environmental changes, or did it cut short a lineage that was still at the height of its ecological dominance? The current state of the evidence leans toward the second interpretation. The dinosaur fossil record in the millions of years immediately preceding the end Cretaceous boundary does not show the kinds of diversity declines that would indicate a group in ecological trouble. The dinosaur communities of the latest Cretaceous were diverse, well established in their ecological roles, and showing no signs of imminent self-generated decline. What ended them was not the slow weakening of a declining lineage. It was the sudden, catastrophic and unprecedented disruption of the physical world they had been successfully inhabiting. The Chicxulub crater, buried beneath the Yucatan Peninsula and the Gulf of Mexico, is the preserved scar of the impact that ended the Mesozoic. It is approximately 180 kilometers in diameter, large enough to be visible from orbit if the rocks that formed in its aftermath were not buried under 66 million years of subsequent sediment. The crater was not identified until 1978, and the connection between it and the end Cretaceous extinction was not confirmed until the early 1990s, after decades of gathering evidence from both the crater and the boundary layer around the world. The confirmation of the impact hypothesis for the end Cretaceous extinction was one of the landmark moments in 20th century Earth science, resolving a debate that had been running since the discovery of the iridium anomaly at the KPG boundary in 1980. The geological detective story that connected the impact, the crater, and the extinction is one of the most compelling examples of how different fields of science, geology, chemistry, physics, paleontology come together to answer questions that no single field could answer alone. The mammals that inherited the post-extinction world were not simply the lucky survivors waiting in the wings. They were the descendants of a lineage that had been evolving alongside the dinosaurs throughout the Mesozoic, occupying the small-bodied ecological roles that the dinosaurs left available, and in doing so accumulating the physiological and cognitive characteristics that would allow their explosive diversification after the extinction. The insulated, active, cognitively flexible small mammal of the Cretaceous night was not a diminished animal awaiting its turn. It was an animal that had been refined by 65 million years of coexistence with the dinosaurs into exactly the form that the post-extinction world would reward. The extinction that killed the dinosaurs was not the beginning of the mammal story. The mammal story had been running for 65 million years before the extinction. The extinction was the moment when the competition that had kept mammals small was removed, and the adaptive radiation that followed was the expression of the potential that the Mesozoic had been suppressing. What the dinosaurs left behind is not only fossils, they left birds. The avian dinosaurs that passed through the end Cretaceous extinction event and diversified into the 10,000 species that inhabit the modern world are not the successors of the dinosaurs. They are the dinosaurs, continuing the lineage in the only form that the extinction event permitted to survive. When a crow solves a problem that a researcher designed to test avian cognition, it is doing something that shares deep evolutionary roots with the cognitive capabilities that some non-avian dinosaurs possessed, and that the lineage has been refining and diversifying for 230 million years. When a hummingbird builds a nest and tends its eggs with the attentive care that small birds provide, it is doing something whose behavioral foundations were present in the dinosaurian lineage millions of years before the first hummingbird existed. The continuity is real. The birds are what the dinosaurs became. The feathers that insulate and display and enable flight in modern birds were present in the dinosaurian lineage tens of millions of years before flight evolved, serving the insulation and display functions that shaped their initial evolution and that remain among their primary functions even in lineages that fly with them. The warm-blooded metabolism that allows modern birds to maintain the activity levels and the geographic ranges that make them the most diverse and widely distributed vertebrate group on land was not an invention of the avian lineage. It was inherited from the non-avian dinosaurian ancestors that the bone histology evidence shows maintained elevated metabolic rates and rapid growth. The parental care that modern birds provide, the most elaborate and sustained parental investment of any reptilian lineage, was present in embryonic form, in the nesting behaviors that the Mesozoic fossil record documents. The behavioral richness of modern birds is not a departure from what the dinosaurs were. It is the fullest expression of what the dinosaurs were always becoming. The world that exists today carries the mark of the Mesozoic in forms that are visible everywhere once you know where to look. The flowering plants that cover most of the Earth's vegetated surface diversified in partnership with the insects and the birds that pollinated them and dispersed their seeds, a co-evolutionary relationship whose origins lie in the late Cretaceous. The birds whose songs fill the forests and fields of every continent are the voices of the dinosaurian lineage, continuing to fill the acoustic landscape of the world in the same way that their Mesozoic ancestors filled it, though with different sounds and different species in different places. The insects that formed so much of the food web of the Mesozoic are still here, still the most diverse animal group on Earth, still filling the small ecological roles that support everything above them. The world that the dinosaurs inhabited has changed beyond recognition, but it has not been rebuilt from scratch. It has been rebuilt from what was left. The rock that preserves the KP boundary, the thin line of iridium-rich clay that marks the moment when one world became another, exists somewhere underfoot on every continent on Earth, buried at depth proportional to the rate of sedimentation in each location over the 66 million years since it was laid down. The world we live in is built on top of the world the dinosaurs built, separated from it by that thin layer of evidence that something arrived from outside and changed everything. The dinosaurs did not know it was coming. The animals that survived it did not know they had survived it. The world that followed did not know what it had replaced. Only we, arriving so late that the event that ended the dinosaurs is as remote from us as the dinosaurs are from each other across their full temporal range, can look back and see the whole arc of the story. And what we see when we look is not extinction and replacement, it is continuation. The dinosaurs are gone, and they are also here, in every bird that calls in the morning, and every track in the mud, and every egg in every nest on every continent. They are the most successful lineage of land vertebrates in the history of the world, and they are still running. Tonight, somewhere in the world, a bird is building a nest. It is selecting material with the same behavioral attentiveness that the fossil record shows dinosaurs applied to nest construction 100 million years ago. It is laying eggs that carry the same chemical signatures, the same developmental logic, the same evolutionary heritage that the Mesozoic nests preserve. It will sit on those eggs in the same posture that exceptional fossil specimens show their ancestors sitting, with the same instinctive care for the temperature and the safety of the clutch. When the eggs hatch, it will feed the hatchlings with the same attentive parental investment that the Mesozoic evidence suggests was present in the lineage long before the birds existed. The Mesozoic is not over. It is nesting in the tree outside. It is calling at dawn. It is everywhere if you know what you're looking at. The dinosaurs did not end. They became us. They became the sky above us and the trees around us, and the world that holds all of it, still going. Sleep well. The trace of the dinosaur lineage that survived the extinction in the form of birds is visible in the modern world in ways that go beyond the obvious physical similarities between birds and the feathered dinosaurs of the Mesozoic. The way a modern bird holds its body, with the horizontal torso balanced over the hips in a way that is fundamentally different from the posture of a lizard or a mammal, reflects the same bipedal body plan that the theropod dinosaurs developed and that birds inherited. The hollow bones that reduce weight for flight in modern birds were present in non-avian theropod dinosaurs as adaptations for the same respiratory system that birds use, a flow-through lung system that is more efficient at oxygen extraction than the tidal lungs of mammals. The scales on the feet of modern birds are not an evolutionary throwback. They are the same structure, in modified form, that covered the unfeathered parts of feathered dinosaurs. The bird is the dinosaur persisting. The fossil record of the first 20 million years after the end Cretaceous extinction, the Paleocene epoch, documents the ecological world rebuilding itself in the absence of the large reptilian animals that had defined it for so long. The first large mammals of the Paleocene were not the elegant, fast-running creatures that modern large mammals suggest. They were bulky, slow-moving animals that were filling the large herbivore and large omnivore roles that the plant-eating dinosaurs had vacated, doing so imperfectly with body plans that were still in the process of being refined by selection. The predators that evolved to hunt these early large mammals were similarly imperfect initial solutions to the ecological problem of large predation without the inherited toolkit of the theropod dinosaur lineage. The world of the early Paleocene was a world in transition, beginning to rebuild the ecological complexity that the Mesozoic had achieved, but working with a reduced set of surviving lineages and with the specific advantages and limitations of the survivors. The other mass extinctions in Earth's history provide context for the end Cretaceous event and for what the survival and recovery process involves. The end Permian extinction, the largest in Earth's history, eliminated so many lineages that the recovery of biodiversity took nearly 10 million years, a recovery period so long that it spans a geological epoch. The end Cretaceous recovery was faster, partly because the extinction was less complete, and partly because the surviving lineages included groups like the mammals and birds that had already been developing the characteristics that allowed rapid ecological diversification. The pattern across all mass extinctions is the same. The disruption eliminates the dominant forms. The survivors diversify into the vacated ecological roles over millions of years, and the resulting ecosystem is different from what preceded it in its composition, but similar in its functional organization. Life does not start over after a mass extinction. It reorganizes. The presence of dinosaur remains in the rocks that underlie every human settlement on Earth is a fact that most people have never considered. The Mesozoic sedimentary rocks that contain dinosaur fossils are buried at varying depths beneath the surface on every continent, including the Antarctic rock that lies under the ice. Every city built on sedimentary rock is built, at some depth below its foundations, on top of a world that contained dinosaurs. The specific fossils, the actual bones of actual animals, are distributed sporadically rather than uniformly. Because fossilization is rare, and because most of the Mesozoic rock that once existed has been eroded away over 66 million years of geological change. But the rock itself, the record of the time when dinosaurs were present, is everywhere. We live on a planet whose geological history includes them as thoroughly as it includes us, and the separation between their world and ours is less absolute than the 66 million years would suggest. The rock remembers. The science of paleontology is not finished with the dinosaurs. It will not be finished with the dinosaurs. Every year, new species are described from new fossils found on every continent, and new techniques for analyzing existing specimens continue to extract information from material that has been available for a century. The CT scanning of skulls reveals brain anatomy without destroying the specimen. The analysis of proteins preserved in bone material, against expectations that proteins should not survive for millions of years, is revealing biochemical information about specific individuals. The isotopic analysis of teeth and bones continues to produce information about diet, migration, and physiology. The study of the skin impressions and feather traces, preserved in exceptional fine-grained deposits, is producing color reconstructions and skin texture information that was unimaginable a generation ago. The dinosaurs are not a closed chapter. They are an ongoing investigation, and the investigation is accelerating. The relationship between dinosaur research and the education of everyone who has ever been a child is a story about what captures human imagination and why. Dinosaurs have been compelling to children for as long as fossils have been in museums and popular books. And the reasons for this are not difficult to find. They were enormous, they were real, they are gone, and their remains are preserved in a form that you can see and touch, and that connects the present to a past, too remote to imagine but too well evidenced to dismiss. The child who stands in front of a mounted skeleton and tries to imagine the living animal is doing something that is not merely sentimental. They are trying to close the gap between the evidence and the reality it represents, to make the past present in the way that all historical understanding requires, and the dinosaur skeleton in the museum makes that gap feel closable in a way that other historical evidence often does not. The bones are real. The animal was real. The world it lived in was real. All of that is waiting to be understood by whoever takes the time to look. The 4 parts of this series have tried to do something specific, to describe the dinosaurs as living animals in a real world, rather than as museum specimens in an abstract past. The world they inhabited was alien in its physical details, unrecognizable in its ecological logic. The lives they led were organized around the same basic challenges that every animal faces: finding food, avoiding death, reproducing. And the specific strategies they developed for meeting those challenges were as varied and as sophisticated as the environments they lived in required. The social lives that some of them led, documented in the nesting colonies and the herding trackways and the parental care evidence and the elaborate display structures, were not simple or reflexive. They were expressions of behavioral complexity that the lineage has been developing for 230 million years, and that continues to develop in the 10,000 bird species that are the living expression of what the dinosaurs became. What we owe to the dinosaurs is not sentiment, it is attention. The attention that paleontologists have given to the fossil record across 180 years of organized scientific study has produced a picture of a world we did not create and cannot visit, inhabited by animals we did not know, following rules we are still working to understand. The attention that the rocks deserve and that the fossils within them deserve is the same attention that any historical record deserves from the people who inherit the world that followed it. The dinosaurs are our predecessors on this planet in the most literal possible sense. They were here first, they were here longer, and the world we inherited was built on the foundations their ecology created. The flowering plants that feed us, the birds whose behavior the dinosaur lineage has been refining for 200 million years, the atmospheric oxygen that their forest ecosystems helped maintain, all of these are part of the inheritance. The rocks that preserve their bones are the receipt. The thin line of iridium-rich clay that marks the boundary between the Mesozoic and the world after it is not a wall. It is a membrane, permeable in the direction that evolution permits. The survivors passed through it, carrying everything that the 165 million years before it had produced in their lineages, and what came through that membrane became the world we inhabit. The mammals carry the warm metabolism and the cognitive flexibility that the Mesozoic refined in the small, fast animals that survived alongside the dinosaurs. The birds carry the dinosaurian body plan, the respiratory system, the feathers, the parental behaviors, the social complexity that the theropod lineage developed, and that the avian lineage has been elaborating ever since. The flowering plants carry the co-evolutionary relationships with pollinators and seed dispersers that began in the Cretaceous and that have been producing new forms and new partnerships ever since. The world did not end at the KPG boundary. It transformed. What transformed into what we have now was built on what the dinosaurs built, and the building has not stopped.